Hello everybody, so today I'm going to do a video about what Atlantis was and everything I've sort of pieced together about Atlantis. Now, I may well find more information later on and change my view on it, but this is my current, what I believe are the facts of it. So Atlantis was founded 126,000 years ago. That was when we first had people living there, and this happened after a cataclysm at about the same time, lifted up what was previously sunken under the earth and lifted it up over the earth, and that place became the Richat structure, which became the capital city. Now, the people that moved there may have moved there from the other side of Africa, from a place called Punt, which is a Somalia, or it's currently in Somalia. It's an island. It's not the whole of Somalia, borders change, blah, 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 but it's currently called Puntland in Somalia, but it's not an island anymore. So they were trying to control the land from there, and they wanted to have a port on the other side. So Punt was one of the original 12 kingdoms in the world, and Atlantis wasn't. So Atlantis was an expansion, if you like. Now, one of the reasons to go to Atlantis was to control Europe, which already had people in it from in Germany, or what we now call Germany, in England and France, which was one country, and in Spain, as well as also in Scandinavia. Now, Scandinavia is a controversial one. According to official records, there's nobody was living there until 10,000 years ago when the ice melted. And that's true, that there was nobody there for about 10,000 years, but there were people there before that. So Scandinavia was one of the original 12 kingdoms. Now, I'm not Scandinavian, I'm from Australia, and Australia, I know, was not one of the original 12 kingdoms. Australia was uninhabited until 65,000 years ago, after another cataclysm. So we've had quite a lot of these cataclysms. What the cataclysms do, they change the sea level. Some parts go up, some parts go down. And during the 126,000 year cataclysm, this part at what we now call the Richat structure went up, allowing people to live there, and it was a great port city. It had naturally occurring concentric rings, allowing it to be really easily defended, had a mountain to the north of it, straight access to the sea, pretty much impossible to defeat, and so they had it there to help to control the areas. Now, from there, of course, then they settled, and we know during another cataclysm about 43,000 years ago, and this is the one which lifted up Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, and a lot of Southeast Asia. That was lifted up, and it's still up. That also lifted up Greece and Italy. So previously they were under the sea, they were lifted up there, and then they were settled by the people from Atlantis. So they also settled a number of other places. They went to China and Japan, which had people in them, and they also, of course, went to India. They went to everywhere, and they also went to visit, but not settle, the Americas. And at what point did they go to the Americas? It's a little bit hard to be sure, but we could probably say around about 100,000 years ago. And they didn't settle there. There was no people in the Americas at that time, but they went there. And one of the places, and I've seen that, is there's these pyramids in the Grand Canyon, believe it or not. There's at least one. It's called the Temple of Isis. It was there before there were Native Americans there. So, and even the Mayans didn't build it, because it's a different kind of pyramid to the ones that the Mayans built. Because the Mayans were from Atlantis, but that's another thing. So that's what happened there. Now, did they have a war, a literal war with Athens? Now, the problem is that Athens they became fairly strong around about maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. Now, Atlantis was destroyed more than 10,000 years ago, 12,000 years ago, according to that. So for them to have a war 7,000 years before they became even vaguely strong is silly. And to suggest that it was a single city when there were other cities as well that were independent, and to suggest that they defeated Atlantis is so ridiculous that it just couldn't possibly be true. So the Greeks lied about that. But what perhaps they meant was that because the Greeks were a colony and they wanted independence and they couldn't get independence, so they kind of imagined themselves standing up against the Atlanteans. And of course the Egyptians were also a colony of Atlantis. So Egypt had previously been under the control of the Ethiopians. Well, they weren't called Ethiopians, they were called Nubians and had different other names. Them to change every 5 years. But there was one kingdom called Kush, which controlled Egypt, and then Egypt had independence as Kemet, or the Black Lands. And then later on, they became known as Egypt, and they were independent. So they fought a war of independence against Atlantis, and they managed to become independent. Now, Greece was not strong enough to do that, but they wanted to be. And the problem was that it was a lot harder to defeat Atlantis than it was to deal with Punt because of the nature of the city, the way that it was designed. And so they certainly would have fought or wanted to fight, but they weren't able to. So when we had, oh, and by the way, the pyramids, and some other people have worked this out, the pyramids were basically power structures. So a bit like how we've got our power lines and we've got mobile phone towers, we've got power structures. That's one of the main reasons that they had pyramids. That was to generate power in an area. So yeah, I mean, people were buried there, but that wasn't really their main function. They had a number of functions, but one of the major ones was so that they could use electricity. So, and they did have electricity in those days. A little bit different to what we have today. It seems to have been wireless electricity. It's a lot more dangerous. So you could just be electrocuted and have lightning bolts shooting out of people's hands. But yeah, a lot more powerful, but a lot cheaper, but a lot more dangerous. And it seems as if that's probably what they had. And so essentially by having the pyramid in the Grand Canyon in America, they were essentially saying that when they visited the Americas, they would need some power to do whatever things they were doing. And, you know, whatever else is in there is probably not particularly significant. So essentially they were just having a place where they could do whatever they needed to do and, you know, have a bit of power. So the thing is there, when they're doing that, so they weren't living in America. They just visited there every so often, had a look and perhaps considering colonising it, but it was too far away. And that's the main reason they didn't. And of course 65,000 years ago we know Australia was settled, and that was settled from Lemuria, also known as Madagascar, and from India. And of course it wasn't called India at the time, it was called Jambuvida, meaning Berry Island. And of course there was a place that lifted up from the sea perhaps for 150 years, and that is something that the Tamils have described as Kumaria Kandam, and we can call Mauritius. Not Mauritania and not Mauritius, but a sunken microcontinent, but that was briefly lifted up over the surface as a result of the cataclysm from 65,000 years ago. It's a temporary lifting, and then it went back down again. And it didn't go back down due to a cataclysm, it just wasn't very much above the surface. It was only a little bit above, and it sort of just, you know, went back down again. So Atlantis became the most powerful city on Earth, and because it was already a part of the most powerful culture on Earth. And this culture, of course, we know, derived from the Anunnaki, and that had been around since humans have been around. And they describe that in Atlantis they had gods there. However, the Great Flood was created by enemy gods, if you like, who were probably also Anunnaki. And of course the Anunnaki described that the Anunnaki did the Great Flood and killed other Anunnaki, and it's sort of like a war. So if you think of the Anunnaki as being 7 tribes, possibly 8, but it seems as if it's 7 tribes, 7 sisters, and the Pleiades, don't know how to say that. There's a star system up there and they all seem to have come from a different star. It's a bit complicated, but yeah. So as for the destruction of Atlantis, it was lifted up. It wasn't sunk. It was never sunk. But what was sunk was Albion, which was England, Ireland, and France, and the Doggerlands, and the Doggerlands was the part that sunk. So that's about 90% of it, and that sunk at the same time that Atlantis was lifted. So the Greeks lied about it, and they lied about it to try to make themselves look good, basically. And the reason, of course, they don't want people to look under Atlantis, and nor do our people want to today look under it, because it would have pyramids under there, that's one thing, and it would have some very powerful structures there that would make all of Greece's achievements look rather minor, all of Rome's achievements look rather minor, and they don't want to have that. So it was it destroyed literally by the gods or not? I kind of look at it, and they say in the Sumerian text, they say it was due to overpopulation and pollution. And that does make scientific sense. We know that with our greenhouse effect, our climate change, that our protective layer, our atmosphere thins, and that leads to meteors, which come all the time, being able to come through. And we know that meteors cause the Great Flood. There's no doubt about that. The only alternative is it was a natural process added to by meteors, but the fact that it was 30 years between them, when the other two, they're normally 25,000, that suggests that it was far from natural. It was delayed, and probably delayed by the people in Atlantis who were targeted. That was the target. Whether it was a deliberate act by an individual god or they were just polluting too much, well, we can debate about that. But so that's the significance of Atlantis. And so if we ever decided to dig under there, there's 120 or 114,000 years worth of history going back from 12,000 to 126,000. We'd have the answers for how to survive climate change, how to defeat cataclysms, and probably quite a lot of technology that we don't have today. And I would say fairly likely that they would have the descriptions for how to build pyramids and what they're just really meant to be for. And I think that we know that. I don't think that this is merely a mystery. So that's what I've sort of concluded from all of that. And of course, underneath there, we could well see the Anunnaki themselves, enormous beings, and also their pets, which are called the Igigi, which are basically dragons. And they were their pets. They were used to do their work for them. They've been described as also being Anunnaki, so from the same planet or same star system, but they were servants. And they were dragons, pretty much. They were Sumerian dragons. So, and they were, well, certainly they were there until 12,000 years ago. All right, so that's it from me. Bye-bye.